Vasily Blucher was celebrated as one of the Soviet Union's great revolutionary heroes, the first recipient of the Order of the Red Banner, and a commander who seemed to embody everything the new Soviet state wanted to project about itself. As commander of the Special Red Banner Far Eastern Army, he controlled a force of roughly 300,000 troops and presided over a vast military region stretching across the Soviet Pacific frontier. But when the Great Purge arrived, Blucher did not just survive it, he participated in it, overseeing show trials and signing off on the purging of subordinates to protect his own position. The machine eventually turned on him anyway. He was arrested in October 1938 and tortured so severely inside Lefortovo prison that he died in custody on November 9, 1938, before his scheduled execution. What makes Blucher genuinely disturbing is not just what was done to him, it is that he spent years doing it to others first, feeding the system that ultimately consumed him. Ivan Konev. Ivan Konev is one of the most decorated commanders in Soviet military history. The general who led the First Ukrainian Front across Eastern Europe, helped liberate Auschwitz, and planted Soviet flags over the ruins of the Third Reich. The problem is that liberation and atrocity traveled in the same columns. Konev's forces advanced with devastating speed through Poland and Germany in 1944 and 1945, and historians have extensively documented the mass rape and killing of civilians that followed in their wake, crimes that Konev was aware of and did little to prevent or punish. After the war, his brutality found new purpose. In 1956, as commander of Warsaw Pact forces, he directed the crackdown on the Hungarian Revolution, an operation that killed approximately 2,500 Hungarians and crushed a popular uprising under tank treads. The Berlin Crisis of 1961 also fell under his command. Konev's career is a reminder that military genius and mass atrocity are not mutually exclusive, and that medals do not cancel out the bodies underneath them. Semyon Timoshenko. Semyon Timoshenko's name is attached to one of the most catastrophic military disasters in modern European history, and he was directly responsible for the decisions that caused it. As People's Commissar of Defense, from June 1940 to July 1941, he oversaw the structural preparation of the Red Army for a war that he then helped ensure it was not ready to fight. Before that, he commanded Soviet forces during the Winter War against Finland, a campaign that turned into a brutal humiliation, with Soviet casualties estimated between 126,000 and 170,000 dead against a vastly smaller enemy. His response to failure was not strategic reform, but punishment, with officers executed or imprisoned for retreats he had made inevitable through rigid and incompetent orders. His tenure left the Red Army brittle and terrified of initiative, two qualities that proved catastrophic when Germany invaded in June 1941. Historians note that the culture of fear Timoshenko enforced contributed directly to the paralysis that cost hundreds of thousands of Soviet lives in the opening weeks of Barbarossa. Lev Meklis. Lev Meklis was not a general in any meaningful military sense. He was Stalin's political enforcer, the head of the Red Army's political directorate, and the most dangerous kind of incompetent, one with the power to destroy people who knew better. He sent thousands of officers to the Gulag or to the firing squad based on denunciations, suspicion, and ideological paranoia, gutting units of experienced leadership in favor of political reliability. His most catastrophic direct intervention came during the Kerch-Feodosia campaign in Crimea in May 1942, where he overrode the commander on the ground, General Kozlov, with a series of orders so strategically illiterate that the result was a catastrophic encirclement. Soviet losses at Kerch in that operation reached approximately 162,000 killed, wounded, or captured, according to historical accounts of the campaign. Meklis was demoted from Army General to Corps General afterward, a punishment laughably inadequate given the scale of the disaster. He remained in positions of influence regardless, because loyalty to Stalin mattered more than the lives of soldiers. Semyon Budyonny. Semyon Budyonny was a man of the 19th century, placed in command of 20th century warfare, and the gap between those two things cost hundreds of thousands of lives. A legendary Civil War cavalry commander, he owed his promotions almost entirely to his personal friendship with Stalin, rather than any demonstrated strategic competence. When the Germans invaded in 1941, Budyonny commanded Soviet forces in the south, and his repeated refusal to authorize retreats resulted in the Kiev encirclement of September 1941, one of the largest battlefield defeats in the history of modern warfare, with approximately 616,000 Soviet soldiers killed or captured. He had been warned. He ignored the warnings because retreating without Stalin's permission felt more dangerous than losing an army group. His Civil War record carries its own darkness as well. Historians, including eyewitness accounts from writer Isaac Babel, who traveled with the 1st Cavalry Army, document pogroms against Jewish civilians in Ukraine carried out under Budyonny's command, massacres that he tolerated or failed to stop. He lived until 1973, loaded with medals, and died peacefully in his bed. Philip Golikov. Philip Golikov may be responsible for more Soviet deaths than many generals who ever fired a shot, because his weapon was silence. As head of Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, from September 1940 to October 1941, Golikov received a steady stream of intelligence warnings from agents across Europe, clearly indicating that Germany was planning a massive invasion. His response was to systematically filter, suppress, and reframe those warnings to align with what Stalin wanted to hear, that the intelligence was enemy provocation, and that Germany would not attack. Analysts who reported accurate assessments were punished. Those who agreed with Stalin's preferred conclusions were promoted. When Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, the Red Army was catastrophically unprepared, and the opening weeks produced Soviet casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Golikov survived the war, survived Stalin, and died in 1980 having never been held accountable. Institutional cowardice, when practiced at sufficient scale, becomes indistinguishable from mass murder. Georgy Zhukov. Georgy Zhukov is the name Soviet history most wants you to remember as heroic, and the inconvenient truth is that the heroism and the horror are inseparable. He was a genuinely brilliant operational commander, the architect of some of the most decisive Soviet victories of the Second World War. He was also a man who treated soldiers as raw material to be spent. Zhukov was notorious for ordering infantry advances through uncleared minefields to preserve time, calculating that human casualties were an acceptable cost. He enforced Order 227, issued July 28, 1942, which placed blocking detachments behind Soviet lines with orders to shoot soldiers who retreated without authorization. Historians estimate that approximately 150,000 Soviet soldiers were executed by their own side during the war, though some scholars debate the exact count. The Battle of Berlin alone cost an estimated 80,000 Soviet dead, partly because Zhukov prioritized speed for political reasons over tactical efficiency. Zhukov won. He also burned through lives at a rate that, in any other context, would define his legacy entirely. Vasily Stalin. Vasily Stalin held the rank of lieutenant general in the Soviet Air Forces, and he owed every centimeter of his career to his surname. The son of Joseph Stalin, he commanded air units he was not qualified to lead, and the consequences were measured in crashes, deaths, and disasters that were covered up. He was prone to reckless disregard for safety protocols during training and air displays, and officers under his command who raised concerns risked being denounced or arrested on fabricated charges. Reports of airshow accidents during his command, including incidents in the early 1950s, suggest a pattern of catastrophic negligence, shielded entirely by his father's name. When Stalin died in March 1953, the protection evaporated instantly. Vasily was arrested, imprisoned, and spent years in confinement before dying on March 19, 1962, an alcoholic in internal exile. His life is a case study in what happens when unchecked inherited power meets complete incompetence, and other people pay the bill. Nikolai Yezhov. Nikolai Yezhov gave his name to an era. The Yezhov's China, the Yezhov period of 1937 and 1938, is synonymous with the worst phase of Stalin's Great Purge, a period of mass terror during which an estimated 750,000 people were executed, according to figures drawn from post-Soviet archival openings. As head of the NKVD, Yezhov held the equivalent of a senior military rank, General Commissar of State Security, and his signature appears on execution orders for tens of thousands of people. His most consequential targets were military. Roughly 35,000 Red Army officers were purged during his tenure, including 3 of the Soviet Union's 5 marshals, decapitating the military's experienced leadership less than 3 years before the German invasion. Historians argue this gutting of the officer corps directly contributed to the disasters of 1941. Yezhov himself was arrested in 1938, tortured, and shot on February 4, 1940, after which Stalin had him erased so thoroughly from official photographs that his disappearance became a defining example of Soviet historical falsification. The term for it is airbrushed from history. He invented the technique on others before it was applied to him. Lavrentiy Beria. Lavrentiy Beria is the name at the bottom of every list like this, and he belongs there. Holding the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union and sitting on the State Defense Committee, the inner war cabinet that ran the Soviet war effort, Beria combined military authority with secret police power in a way that made him the most dangerous man in the Soviet Union outside of Stalin himself. He ran the Gulag system at its peak, when the camp population exceeded 1.5 million prisoners, with hundreds of thousands dying from conditions, starvation, and execution. He personally signed the order for the Katyn massacre on March 5, 1940, the execution of 21,857 Polish military officers, police, intellectuals, and professionals, a figure acknowledged officially by the Russian government in 1990. Soviet investigative records compiled after his arrest document a pattern of sexual violence in which Beria used his position and secret police apparatus to abduct women and girls from Moscow streets, crimes whose full scope remains difficult to quantify, but whose reality is documented. When Stalin died in March 1953, Beria's colleagues moved against him within months, so terrified of what he might do with unchecked power that they had him arrested, tried in secret, and shot on December 23, 1953. Even the men who had worked alongside him for decades understood that the only safe Beria was a dead one. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.